You go first.
Well, we could talk about the golden years that we're having in New York. We spend time going to the theater, to museums, dance recitals, and it's all very close to where we are. Most things we go to, we either take a bus or a cab. They're so close. We seem to average about one cultural thing a day. That doesn't mean we do it every day, but sometimes we do 2 or 3 things in one day. Recently, we've seen some very nice plays, and that's a way to get together with our old friends who live in Englewood, New Jersey. They are only about a half-hour car ride into the city, and we're about a half-hour bus ride to where we have to go.
What was the most exciting event, the most exciting events in your lives?
Mine was getting married to my wife.
Likewise. Because that changed our lives.
Oh, yes.
We went from being single people to starting a whole family. And one of the wonderful things about living here is that our children have a much easier time visiting us here in Manhattan than in Stony Brook. Just this weekend, we had Tuvia visiting from Israel, Kathy visiting from Boston, and Robert just popped in, coming from his master's in Indiana. And we'll be going in 2 weeks down to Philadelphia because Gregory just wrote a book about the city planner of Philadelphia, and he's having a book signing, and then invited the family for dinner following the book signing, and he's selling his books. We hope it's a great success. And Nicholas and Claudia, who live in Washington, D.C., come up to the apartment where we have very frequent family gatherings for various holidays. So it's become a center of family life as well as cultural
We decided that even though we don't need 2 bedrooms, we decided to get a second bedroom in our apartment because that's a way that we'll have room for people to come. And over the 8 years that we've been here, we've had 780 visitors, stayovers, in about 400 days of the time.
What were the most significant events that occurred that you remember in your life? Not just personal things, events.
world events.
World events and personal events, both. What do you remember as the most significant events?
Significant or just remember?
I think 8/11, 9/11.
9/11, well, that is significant. The destroying of the Twin Towers in Manhattan by the terrorists that flew planes into it. That happened on my birthday. It happened September 11th, 2001, and that was my birthday. I remember we were living out in Stony Brook, and I remember sitting in the screened-in porch that we had and hearing the news, and who came over? Sumner Levine came over, and we were talking about this. That was a significant event, but I've had other significant events, but go ahead.
Well, the personal significant event that we just talked about was our marriage, because that changed our lives, and it was very important in our lifespan. And that was in 1946, August 8th, 1946. And it was a very happy day and a significant day. Other important days, I remember in college we got news that President Roosevelt had died, and everybody was crying. He was a very wonderful president, and he did a lot for the poor in the United States. He was a president that we honored very much. I remember that as being a significant day, as well as talking about presidents. When the president was shot, President Kennedy was shot, was a big shock, because he also was a very fine man who cared about the people. And politics today are very mixed. There are those of us who love President Obama, and it was a very significant time in American politics to have somebody of color as President of the United States. And he has very wonderful ideas. And unfortunately, the Republicans, who are money crazy, are not going along with all his social programs. So there are big battles politically in the United States right now. Can you think of other important events?
Well, the Kennedy assassination was one, but also the Vice President Johnson, who took over from Kennedy when he was assassinated and became president, pushed through a lot of the social ideas that Kennedy was for, mainly the Civil Rights and the Civil Rights Act and Voting Act, which allowed many people who were being obstructed, being stopped from voting by all kinds of mechanizations like poll taxes and so. So that was a significant thing. Those are mainly the ones I could think of. The end of the Second World War was a significant thing because everyone was celebrating, and in the area where we lived, but we didn't live at that time, there were hundreds of thousands of people celebrating when the war was finally over.
And then were you shocked at all the stories that came out of what happened in the concentration camps?
Well, we knew about that before the war was over, but I was a little too young to understand it. I was only 18, 19, 20, and I was more wound up with going to school and not understanding what was going on.
In my family, my father would come home with such a sad face every night, and we had a little radio. There was no television at that time. A little radio, and the minute he walked into the apartment, he would turn on the radio, and he said, "It's bad news. We are getting bad news. They are murdering all the Jews in Europe. Hitler must be stopped. He must be stopped. This is the stories that we are getting are so heartbreaking, so unbelievable." And even today, it is unbelievable that 6 million Jews were destroyed, and we're getting so many interesting stories of people who have survived, miraculous savings. One person, the gun didn't go off, so his life was saved. Other stories that we heard from friends in Stony Brook, they were in the car, in a train, going to one of the death camps, and the door opened a crack, and our friend Helena pushed her husband off the train and she jumped after him, and they walked for miles and miles and miles and miles and escaped to South America, and then they came to America. And there are stories and stories and stories.
Yeah, my father also was very despondent when he would come home from work, and he would hardly say anything, but he would mention that there are terrible things going on in Europe. And this was in 1942, about 3 years before the war was over. At that time also, there was a resistance for Americans to go into the Second World War because they were more isolationist and they didn't really care what was happening in Europe. But Roosevelt had a brilliant idea, since France and England didn't have the money to pay for the materials he formed the idea of Lend-Lease. They would lend us all the ships they were building and all the munitions and so, and we would presumably pay back. But as it turned out, they were never expected to pay back, and they didn't pay back. But I remember one other great thing. When Truman was president, after Roosevelt died, he started the idea with Marshall, the Secretary of State, of the building up Europe and helping Europe. And that was one of the great things that the United States did by helping to build up the Europe which was destroyed during the war. The other great thing that came out of Roosevelt and Truman's thing was the GI Bill of Rights. All soldiers who could go to school, to an accredited school, their tuition and stipends were paid for by the federal government. And that probably did more to making great advances of this country in the middle and latter part of the second part of the 20th century, because we had a highly educated group and they produced many, many things for the use of people and so. Unfortunately now we have a group of politicians who don't want to pay for things, and things are starting to run down. But things will turn around eventually and get better.
Talking about memories, something just flashed in my mind. Now everybody is so attached to television. I remember when I was about 12, my father bought one of the few television sets that were being sold because he was very interested in modern technology. And we had a set in our living room, our small living room, and people would ring our doorbell and say, "We heard you had a television set. May we see what it's like?" So my mother would set up bridge chairs in the living room like a little theater, and strangers would come to the door and ask if they could see our television set. So that was very, very interesting. I remember they had interviews with famous people, and our first sets were black and white, and it was a little while until they came into color. And so I often think that I have lived during such a fascinating time that when I was a little girl, I heard stories that my grandfather would walk around the radio and couldn't imagine where all these voices were coming from. Then the airplane was invented, and what would we do now without airplanes? And then the computer and the telephone and all these modern technological advances have changed the world for our children. Our children have no idea what it would have been like a generation ago.
Now, of course, we have Skype so that you can watch people around the world on your tabletop computer and see what they're doing. And it's like it's phones with pictures.
So here we are sitting in New York, and we put on Skype, which I just learned how to do it, and talk to my grandchildren and great-grandchildren in Israel as if they were in the next room. It's really amazing, just amazing.
The man on the moon was not a big event.
Wow, how could
Well,
we forget the
no,
man in the moon?
the whole NASA program of putting a man on the moon and the probes into the other planets is a major step ahead. Of course, the spin-off to all of the technology that was developed was what brought about the small computers. And so when they sent up a rocket to survey another planet, they had a computer on it. They couldn't put a big mainframe, so they had to design computers that the size of a bread box. And that was a big spin-off of the NASA program of putting a man on the moon, was to learn how to miniaturize all the electronics. For example, the camera we're talking into now is about 6 inches long and about 3 inches wide. And it sits on a little tripod on the table in front of us. But that also has led to the idea of cell phones. People now carry around cell phones and talk to other people around the world that they can dial up to. And also, people use these iPads to connect in to the internet and look up all kinds of information. It's like having all the libraries in the world in your hand.
So
And
it's
who knows?
amazing.
Yeah. The other great thing is the advance of biological medicines, and people are living much longer. That's why I'm
How old are you?
90 years old, and I've lived this long because I'm able to get good health helps, and when I get sick, I get medicines which immediately controls my sickness. And when I look at the obituaries, almost every week there are people who live well into their 90s. In fact, the oldest, one of the old men, the oldest person who was in the First World War died recently. And before he died, he was interviewed, and the columnist asked, "How come you've lived so long?" And she thought he would say, "I didn't smoke, or I didn't drink, or I have medicines." He said, "When I'm dying, I don't." And that was a great statement. But the advance of medical advances have helped us to live much longer. Of course, your mother and I, and we're talking to the grandchildren, your grandmother and grandfather, your Safta and Saba. We don't smoke, we eat well, and we don't drink very much alcohol, and we don't take drugs. That's why we're living long. And we expect to be around for many more years.